For our first topic, this past Saturday marked the opening of the Hangzhou Asia Games, which brings together more than 12,000 athletes from the 45 member states of the Asian Olympic Council. This is the largest Asian Games to have ever taken place and larger than next year's Olympics in Paris is expected to be. In a way, it seems like this is China taking an opportunity to distinguish its technological capabilities and frame itself as a politically responsible power. Digital fireworks have been used for the sake of environmental responsibility, and augmented reality glasses have been provided to the audience. There are even promises of robots at certain venues, which will provide guidance and security to guests. What is the reception of these games, both in China and internationally? China has historically used these large sporting events for political fanfare, but it seems like this could draw further animosity from Chinese citizens already struggling economically. On the other hand, they may welcome a show of competence, perhaps some entertainment, and an opportunity for China to assert itself.
Like all games, China, hosted these games to score not just sports superiority, but also mostly to use as a way to express China's strategic intent. As usual, China never shy away from politicizing the sport. This one is no exception. One of the most important utility for the Chinese Communist Party is to use the Asia Games to dig itself from regional and global isolation. And they play the Asia for Asians game with great fanfare and to show, as you say, China wants to show the world that it's a responsible country. But this all sounds very hollow and hypocritical because the countries that are threatened and bullied by China are mostly Asian countries. You look at China's periphery, most of the countries were hostile to China for all kinds of Chinese imperialistic, hubristic territorial claims. So there are very few Asian head of states actually showed up in Hangzhou, despite China's claim. China always sort of places diplomatic and strategic priority to countries outside of Asia, as a matter of fact, not necessarily Asian countries. But its attempt to use these Asia Games as a China-led global kumbaya has failed miserably because China initially, several months ago, wanted to show China is not only the leader of the Asia, but also to a much larger region. It invited Russia and Belarus to participate in the games. That drew huge international backlash, and more than a dozen countries in Asia decided not to go, to boycott. So that forced China to actually change the plan and disinvite Russia and Belarus. So this shows that international public opinion is not really on China's side. And China also issued invitation to Australia and New Zealand to participate in the games. Australia and New Zealand showed no interest, and they declined to actually go to Hangzhou this time. And I think most obviously also China used games like this to rally anti-West and anti-US forces. The most prominent figure in the Hangzhou game this week is the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. He got a royal treatment. And as a matter of fact, China went far beyond its usual protocol and sent a Chinese jet plane to Damascus to take Assad from Damascus to Hangzhou for the game. And also, he played the game to the premier of South Korea. The president of South Korea refused to go, so he cold-shouldered the South Korean premier, and he at the opening ceremony, the Chinese television showed that Xi Jinping shook hands with all the 10 sort of leaders from the countries, except the South Korean premier. It's kind of a humiliation game. But China also used this Asia game in Hangzhou as a way to sort of to smooth out its BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, in the Asia-Pacific region. Particularly, China was cozy up to Syria and Kuwait. The Crown Prince of Kuwait was there. So China obviously probably will want to sign some deals with them. And you asked me about how the citizens reacted to this. The first thing on the minds of a lot of citizens, particularly in Hangzhou, was this extravaganza and total wastefulness of this game. Because Asia game is very costly. No country, as a matter of fact, no country in Asia wanted to host this game because it's very expensive. China was the only bidder. There was 56 sports facilities for this game. You add up to this kind of a huge landmark infrastructure projects for this game over the last 5 or 6 years, China has spent total more than $310 billion for this game. This is at a time when China has a massive unemployment, deep economic retraction, and a growing popular disenchantment against the party. The city of Hangzhou was almost like a ghost city. It's a Potemkin metropolis where most people are not allowed to move around freely to create an image of happiness, paradise, and consummate harmony under the great and brilliant leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and Secretary General Xi Jinping himself. So this whole game, even though China might score some kind of popularity score, but all sounds very hollow and superficial to me.
For our next topic, there was a flare-up in tension over China's illegal fishing operations and brazen disrespect for other nations' exclusive economic zones. The Chinese Coast Guard installed a floating barrier in waters within the Philippines economic zone, which is disputed by China with their 9-dash line map, but has been ruled against by the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration. Despite this, China still claims sovereignty over the Scarborough Shoal where this incident took place, and then tensions rose as a Chinese Coast Guard cutter cut off and chased Filipino fishermen attempting to enter the waters. We've talked before about the global implications of China's illegal overfishing operations. Miles, could you speak more about this incident and how it fits into the broader picture here?
Well, this incident obviously is just a very isolated incident, but it shows a much greater threat by the Chinese fishing fleet. China has the world's largest fishing fleet. Most of its fishing activities were actually illegal, and we call it illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It's IUU fishing. China has basically, penetrated pretty much every fishing area of the world. China has depleted the fishing resources along its coast. So China went out to all the places. In the coast of the Pacific alone, China has something like 17,000 fishing ships. So various countries have tried to push back, but it's difficult because of the size and the scale of the IUU fishing by the Chinese fishing fleet globally. The Chinese fishing fleet even went to Galapagos, the global treasure of marine wonders. And China basically went there and catch a lot of important and protected species. So this has caused a lot of trouble. Now, different countries has responded separately. Indonesia, for example, whenever a Chinese fishing fleet showed up, they just burned up the fishing ships. And globally, you can see more than 300 Chinese illegal fishing boats have been sunk by various countries. Despite this, China continue its IUU fishing. This really is a global scourge, and China, because of this, further enhances its image as a global pariah when it comes to IUU. And I want to mention this. There's something that's very ironic of this. A few weeks ago, China condemned Japan for its release of nuclear wastewater into the ocean, into the Pacific, along the area that China and Japan and South Korea all share the maritime domain. And China state media has fanned the danger of the nuclear radioactive elements in those waters. But ironically, China's illegal fishing fleet showed up near the Japanese EEZ zone and conducted illegal fishing in the last 2 weeks. If this were so unsafe, why would the Chinese fishing fleet would go there, catch fish, and feed its people? So this just shows you how hypocritical the Chinese government is.
It is another incredible show of hypocrisy. Something I maybe just want to press further on, we often think of this overfishing in terms of its implications for the climate and, as a challenge in terms of reining China in, maybe not necessarily the climate, but environmentally, the ecosystems, the ocean. But it also seems that it creates potential flashpoints for escalating tension, even if it's simply fishing boats at the start. China is rather aggressive with these fishing boats, and it could potentially escalate. How common is it that things like this escalate actually into, ships cutting one another off, and what sort of practices do the Chinese fishermen use in these waters?
Oh, it's very dangerous. For example, China had a huge and very tense encounters with South Korean Marine Police. And at some point, the confrontation led to death of Chinese fishermen and also South Korean maritime police personnel. This is several years ago, but this kind of incidents continued. China has sent some of its fishing boats to the Japanese coastal area to harvest precious coral, and this caused a huge uproar in Japan. But the Japanese maritime and Coast Guard personnel confronted the Chinese ships. As I mentioned earlier, the Indonesian government was so totally pestered by the Chinese illegal fishing and IUU fishing within its EEZ zone. And several years ago, they just fired cannons and blown up the Chinese fishing ships. After that, this kind of behavior has never scaled back. China continued to do the illegal fishing. Along the coast of West Africa, for example, China also conducted very egregious illegal fishing there too. So the IUU activities by the Chinese fishing fleet is global. It really demands the United Nations to take action. It's not only an economic misbehavior, it's also the issue fundamental to the international order, that is sovereignty and exclusive economic rights to some of the areas that belong to individual sovereign states. So China is a country that is sort of, unhinged and unbridled, and this has to stop.
For our last topic, Miles, you have just returned from a trip to Hungary. You spoke at the Danube Institute conference on geopolitical conflicts in Budapest, and I'm sure you had many more fruitful discussions outside of this. Hungary is at a very interesting position in the international system, and particularly the Western alliance system as of late, going against the grain on certain issues and even experiencing some friction with the U.S. What did you take away from this trip with regards to Hungary and its relationship to China and the U.S., but even more broadly, China-Europe relations?
I think that China has engaged Europe as a sort of strategic wedge against the United States. But that game mostly has backfired. So I think the EU has a very strong position on China. EU defining its relationship with China as one of systemic rivalry. That's pretty, accurate in a way. By systemic, the EU means that it's political and ideological, not just economic. So China has been eager to sort of reverse that trend, and they found one very important spot, that is Hungary. Hungary is a very peculiar case because Hungary, led by the current Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, is fighting the war against the woke West, as he termed it. That is, he considered himself a protector of the tradition, of heritage. On social issues, Hungary is pretty much like against the trend in Europe and in America in a way. And I think that Hungary is confusing the woke West and the West itself as a whole. And because of that, I think Hungary is taking a much closer, a much cozier relationship with China and with Russia, the ultimate enemies of the West. I don't think that's a very good position. But now, because of that kind of approach, China basically is using Hungary, for example, as some kind of Trojan horse. Huawei, the company that has been shunned by most European countries, certainly by the United States, has a huge footprint in Hungary. It is a manufacturing base for Huawei in Hungary. China's automobile battery has several plants in Hungary, and they use that as the way to penetrate the European market. On the other hand, though, there are some sheer realities. That is, China's engagement with the European countries normally doesn't go well. The deeper China is involved economically, culturally, diplomatically with the European countries, and China normally has become less and less popular. Hopefully, that trend will show its efficacy in Hungary. Overall, I think Hungary is very dynamic. The people are so nice, and don't forget, Hungary is the first country that rose up on a popular level against the Soviet communist system in 1956. I enjoy my trip to Hungary, and I really use this trip to pay my tribute and respect for the Hungarian spirit, for freedom, and for democracy. I wish Hungary well, and I hope we, in the end, that in this new struggle against tyranny and dictatorship led by China and Russia, that Hungary eventually will be on the right side of history.
It really is an interesting country as an example to show how the political divides in our country affect our alliance system. And as you say, I hope that, the threat posed by countries like China and Russia can overcome this. It makes me think, I wonder, you have a country like Hungary who has a sort of issue with certain ideological trends in America, and so might feel more comfortable, I would say, probably with a Republican president running our diplomatic and foreign policy engagements. From your experience in the Trump administration, did you find the opposite was true at all with other European countries before? Do you think we face a sort of fundamental division where some of our European allies would wish to be led by a Democratic president and others would wish that we were led by a Republican? Or do you think that the threat posed by China simply overrides this?
I think the Democrats, Republican administrations, their ultimate goal on China are pretty similar. As you can see, the new China policy as developed by the Trump administration is pretty much like continuing under the Biden administration. The difference is how to approach this. In the Republican administration, we normally would tell our friends and allies the first principle, that is what's most important, what's at stake. We do not tend to stick to in our face if they disagree with us on some social issues and on other issues that is important, but is not the most important issues. I think that's the difference of methodology and an approach, not a difference of strategic intent. In countries like Hungary, they are very small. They are very dependent upon foreign investment and foreign economic engagement. We would appreciate their sensitivity on that. But ultimately, I think we should respect their sovereign decision. We should also show respect for their process. And ultimately, and I think they'll realize that America is always a force for good. I think in most Hungarians, I've not met one Hungarian during my trip who didn't show appreciation for this deep commitment to freedom and democracy in Hungary. As I say, I visited the House of Terror, which is the museum dedicated to document the Soviet repression and suppression of Hungarians, particularly 1956 Hungarian uprising. It was very telling, and I was deeply moved. So I hope those memories will serve as a good guidepost for what freedom means to West, to the United States, to Hungary, and to the rest of the world.